Howdy, my name's John Goodling, and this is episode 4 of my boat project with my brother. So, I'm an engineer from Auburn, and it it kind of made sense to me to characterize the engine and impeller, and to some extent the boat. So, I made a Google Sheets page to explain exactly how to characterize the engine. So it looks pretty complicated right now, but it's really not if you know what to look for. So the first thing is the key. You have your inputs, your outputs, your constants, and your calculations. Calculations are in between steps that I didn't feel like making a big calculation for, so I just split it up into two steps. And it's also kind of a check to make sure that I'm doing everything correctly. Constants are things that can change but generally don't, like the density of gasoline, the density of air, the stoichiometric fuel ratio, those types of things. Outputs are things that you can read, things you can gather information from, and inputs are things you can change. So if I bored this engine out or got like a 6.0 or something, I could change up the bore and the stroke, and it would output different displacements, which would change up this entire graph. It's all got feedback to it, and that would tell me how the boat would change its characteristics. So the first thing that I did was laid out what the engine is with these first three, and then the this next bit, the tank size and the displacement, are have to do with the boat. The Crouch's constant is a metric, or it's a unitless dimension that characterizes the whole form of a boat, and it's just a number essentially that goes into calculating the speed of a boat based off of its amount of drag and horsepower. So, for instance, a pontoon boat would have something like 150, and then one of those really high performance speed crafts might have a 250. So, based off of my hull form, I would have about 210. Of course, that can be changed once we experimentally find out the correlation between RPMs of the engine and the speed of the boat. And then performance boost is the approximation of how much performance our engine gained. So the stock would be one. Uh, I, I assume we have about 25% increase based off of the dual plane intake manifold, oversized carburetor, Zoomy, and the Zoomy headers, and the stage two camshaft. Now, once I got all of that stuff figured out, I did a little sanity check. This is a 5.2 or a 350, 325 engine. So those check out and tell me that these three numbers are correct for this engine. Uh, and then from that, I could figure out the air fuel ratio. So I wanted a method where I could calculate, if we were on race day, I would enrich the fuel ratio because that's where the most performance is. And then if we were out on the lake and I wasn't racing or anything, I would want to lean it out so that I can conserve fuel. And I wanted to be able to characterize that in a graph because there's no method for us to know how much fuel we have. We don't have a fuel gauge. So if we open up the fuel tank and we can't see down into it, or it's a wavy day or something, we need to be able to tell we've been on the water for 4 hours doing about this speed or this many RPMs, and we probably need to go get some more gas. That being said, with a 28-gallon fuel tank, we're probably never going to run out of fuel. That could last for a long time. And the boat's very light. That's the displacement that I got from putting the hull in the water and SolidWorks approximation based off of the density of the materials that we used. So based off of that, well, moving forward, I calculated the throttle. So for the engine, we have a max RPM, an idling RPM. The maximum throttle is 100%. The minimum throttle is 12%, which is an approximation. And based off of those four numbers, I generated a y equals mx plus b curve, and those are m and b in that calculation, which allows me to calculate the amount of fuel going in based off of the throttle, which allows me to characterize fuel consumption in liters per minute because metric is always easier to do calculations in. So I got a bunch of RPMs and the throttle, which gives me my rich stoichiometric and lean consumption in liters per minute per RPM. And I don't think in metric. I can do calculations in metric, but oddly enough, I don't think in liters per minute. I think in gallons per hour. So this next um, group is that exact same graph, but in gallons per hour, which tells me that at 3,000 RPMs, will consume about 6 gallons per hour at stoichiometry, which is reasonable. This is kind of a sanity check. That's kind of what you would expect at 3,000 RPMs per hour in gallons. Now, based off of that, and then dividing the tank size, which is 28 gallons from last episode, that gives us the number of hours that we can run. Now, uh, that tells me that we can run for 4.6 hours at 3,000 RPM if we're running at stoichiometric, which is very useful to know because that's about what we would do in a day. If we're riding around all day, we might grab lunch, we might slow down, stop at a rope swing at a lake, and that's nice to know. And then we can extend it out to 5 hours if we lean the fuel ratio out. If we lean it way out, we can get 5 hours. Now, from that, I took fuel consumption and made a graph, which I plan on printing out and putting underneath the dash in the boat. And we can use this graph to essentially figure out how much fuel we have. And it's interesting to know. It's in my nature. I have to know these types of things. Now, for the next bit, we're going to skip down to where I characterized the pump curve. So I took a Berkeley pump curve. So this is standard for a jet drive Model 12J. And then, so JC defines how it attaches to the boat hull. So that the C doesn't necessarily matter, but then A is the impeller size. So it's fortunate that they use A as the standard impeller size on this graph. And it tells us essentially how many shaft horsepower are required and come out, because I assume there's minimal loss through the system on the order of 95 to 98% efficiency. Meaning if we put 400 horsepower in, we're going to get 400 horsepower thrust out. And this tells you how many RPMs you have to get to, this correlates RPMs to horsepower. Now, when we couple this to an engine, it's very important that these curves, uh, if you have too much horsepower, you can exceed the horsepower per RPM of the impeller, and that means that so we have a stainless steel impeller. If we have an engine that can run way up here, so at 5,600 RPMs, it's doing 550 horsepower, we will destroy the impeller. The impeller will begin to cavitate, it'll start to eat itself, and it will essentially implode and blow itself out the back. So we don't want that. On the flip side, if we can't achieve this maximum RPM, let's say our engine can only do 400 horsepower, that means that at 5,000 RPM we will bog down the engine, which is something that we don't necessarily want. We want the pump curve of the impeller to end where the engine does, roughly. Now, we ended up sizing it correctly. The LM7 should be producing about 440 horsepower. I'll get into that later. But I wanted to characterize this pump curve so that I could display it in this graph. And that's essentially what this is. I took the RPMs, the horsepowers from that curve, approximately. Now, none of this is perfect. And then I correlated that with torque as well so that we know how much torque the impeller needs versus how much the engine is producing at a given RPM. And based off of that, I was able to characterize the pump curve. And I displayed that out here. So this is exactly how many horsepower of thrust we will be producing based off of this curve, and not off the actual graph, the curve that I generated over here. Um, and this is how much horsepower we will deliver and require at each given RPM. Now, as long as the torque is higher for the engine than it is for the jet drive, we won't bog down the engine. But this is a good check. Now, once I had that, I was able to figure out the approximate speed using that Crouch's constant. I can approximate the speed based off of the horsepower, the weight, and the Crouch's constant to get a rough speed. Now, the approximate speed at idle 750 RPMs will be about 5.5 miles an hour. And then in theory at 4,000 RPM, we should be sitting at about 75 miles an hour, which is pretty fast, but it's fairly reasonable considering this is a 400 horsepower engine in a 14-foot boat that weighs 1,550 pounds. And all of this is just so that I can adjust in the end. If we hold at 44,000 RPMs and we end up going, I don't know, say 70 miles an hour, I can adjust this crouch constant down to get our actual crouch constant based off of experimentation, which is very useful because then I can redefine this pump curve, or not the pump curve, the approximate speed curve. And then based off of the speed and the hours running curve, I can get our distance on a tank. So at 3,000 RPMs, if we hold that constant, we should be able to get about 220 miles. And that will update with the speed, approximate speed, if that ever changes with a crouch constant. But that's very useful to know because if we plan, say, a river trip or a lake trip, we can we can figure out exactly how far we're going to be going and know when we're going to stop for fueling. I also wanted to figure out the miles per gallon, which is atrocious compared to cars, but not too bad for it, considering it's a 5.3 liter engine on a boat. So 7.95 miles per gallon isn't the worst. That being said, we're blowing through a lot of gas. Uh, Now, the next thing I wanted to do is make a torque curve for the engine, or this would, I guess, be a torque and horsepower curve for the engine, so that I can adjust the performance booster. Now, I basically just took a dyno test from a stock LM7, which they're rated for 290 horsepower factory, but a lot of the guys who put them on dynos actually get about 350 horsepower. And when I looked up the dyno, I just plugged in the torque curve, took it through the calculation, and horsepower stock is about 350. These numbers don't have to be perfect, they don't have to be super accurate, but that's what I ended up with. So maximum of about 357 horsepower, which is really good. And it maxes out at about 5,000 RPM, which is the maximum RPM that our impeller can really handle. Now, with the stage 2 camshaft and all the upgrades I made, I multiplied the torque from the stock by 25%, 1.25, so 25% gain. And that gave me a different torque curve, which I was then able to figure out the horsepower for. And that's how I arrived at the approximate 440 horsepower. So our new LM7 should be producing that much horsepower, which, if you look at the pump curve, which I just imported to be right next to it, tells us that our engine will begin to bog down somewhere between 5,000 and 550 RPM, which means that the engine will never get hurt by running in a bogged down state and uh, will never cavitate the impeller, at least in theory if we do everything correctly. I wanted to get the exact bogged down speed, so I just interpolated between the two, finding an intersection point. It says that our our maximum speed that we could not exceed would be 5,160 RPMs. The engine without the impeller could go much faster. We've gotten it that fast outside of the water, but it's not good for anything. And we designed this engine for low power torque. And I represented all of that with this pump curve up here, or this horsepower with the stage 2. So you've got your torque, your horsepower, and your pump, and where they intersect is the maximum RPM. Now, for cooling, I wanted to characterize cooling because we don't have a radiator. I didn't want a big old radiator sticking out in the wind. I wanted it water cooled. And what we ended up doing was we used a pool heat exchanger. Regular boat coolers are extraordinarily expensive, and I didn't feel like spending $2,000 to get one. You can buy a boat heat exchange or a pool heat exchanger for a boiler system for heating up pools for like $300, and they have massive amounts of BTUs. But I wanted to characterize it, or at least approximately, make sure I was in the right uh, order of magnitude. Uh, so that's what I did. It was stainless steel. It's pressure rated much higher and temperature rated much higher than what we'd ever use it for. So I got the horsepower output, the BTUs per hour in that. I just converted horsepower to BTUs. Fairly simple calculation for stock and not stock. And then because I didn't think we would never run this at max RPM, max horsepower for more than about 2 minutes because uh, it's very scary. You would be doing like 100 miles an hour, 105 miles an hour. So we'll probably never do that for more than 2 minutes. Uh, so we don't need all of this cooling. We only need to make sure that we don't heat soak the engine. Most of the time, it's going to be more like 2,000 RPMs, 3,000 RPMs, where we're comfortable, where we feel safer. Uh, so I figured about a third of the cooling would be more than enough, and it was. We've never even gotten the temperature really hot. It barely gets to operating temperature. So I divided this by a third, and then that gives me 300,000 to 378,000 kilobtus of cooling, or 378 kilobtus of cooling. Now, that's a pretty reasonably sized heat exchanger for a pool, and that's what I ordered. I got it off Amazon, and it's been working great so far. So that is how I calculated uh, the boat engine and pump. So I'll be making updates to this as we get the maximum speed figured out. I'll adjust the crouch constant, perhaps adjust the performance booster of the camshaft and the zoomies and everything. If we ever decide to bore it out in the future, I'll change that and I'll let you guys know. So that's the end of episode 4, and thank you very much.